Welcome to the Sporting News Fantasy Fastball Podcast. My name is David A. Arnott, sitting here with Bill Bender, and we're just past the halfway point of the Major League Baseball season for most teams, and so we figured we'd do a mid-season wrap-up type thing. Usually the midpoint of the season happens right before the All-Star game. So, Bill, who are some of the guys that before the season you might have thought, yeah, I'll be pretty good, but are really surprising you with how well they've played thus far?
I think the two guys that stand out starting in the American League would be Adrian Beltre. I think we've talked about him on this podcast before. We both kind of had a feeling that he'd be okay with Boston, but I don't think either one of us knew he'd be as good as he is. And what he's done has been a pleasant surprise. He's gone from maybe a corner infield play to an everyday starting third baseman. And now the challenge is with the injuries Boston have is whether or not he can continue to do that.
Yeah, I mean, I thought before the season that he'd be pretty good and a solid mid-round pick for reasons that are completely different than the reason why he's been good this year. I didn't think his batting average would be like this. I thought he'd be kind of a Mike Cameron type player without the steals, but at corner infield, the way Mike Cameron used to be, I should say, not this year. But hitting a lot of home runs, high slugging, not necessarily batting average or steals or even RBI guy, but just having those home runs made him a good play.
Yeah, and I think it goes beyond the splits and the stuff that we break down. I mean, as you look at it from just a pro baseball perspective, he's finally playing on a contender. He's no longer stuck in Seattle playing on a 90-95 loss team. He's on a team that is in the thick of the race. He likes Fenway Park. And I think, whereas some owners might want to sell high on him, I would keep him and go ahead and use him in the second half.
Now, there's another guy that you have written down on your list right here that is, for my money, the front runner for the American League MVP right now.
Robinson Cano, yeah, and what he has done in New York has been phenomenal. We know he likes the park, but as I showed in our fantasy tutorial blog that we have on the Fantasy Source, he's consistent. He's consistent at home and away. He's consistent against lefties and righties. He's consistent with all his splits. And I think he'll continue to do that. And like you said, he'll probably be the AL MVP at this point.
Shifting over to the National League, there's at least one MVP candidate that you've also got written down here. And it's very interesting because he didn't make the All-Star game.
And I think everybody knows right now that Joey Votto deserves to be in the All-Star game. He has more home runs than
Everyone,
yeah, in the National League. As I look off my sheet here, he has more RBIs than Teixeira and Fielder. He's done everything right, but he happens to be stuck on a team, an all-star team where Ryan Howard is who Charlie Manuel picked. And you can't blame Charlie Manuel for that, but from a true fantasy perspective, Joey Votto is one of the top 10 players in the league. He'll probably be a first-round pick next year based on what he's doing, and I look for him to continue delivering in that park with that team.
Now, do you see him moving forward being that type of four-category guy minus the steals, or do you think that it's only safe to say the three categories are the ones, home runs, RBIs, runs, are the ones we're going to be looking for from him?
I think he'll continue to hit at a high average, and he'll continue to play well at that ballpark. But I think the key with him is Scott Rowland has to stay healthy, Brandon Phillips has to stay healthy, and Johnny Gomes continues to hit well. I mean, that's a pretty loaded lineup. A lineup that I'm getting a lot of, not getting credit for saying this across the room, but I think they're going to contend for that NL Central all the way through and make some noise in the National League playoffs right now.
Now, there's a fourth guy on your list that we're going to talk about as a very pleasant surprise for fantasy owners, who several years ago was that 2020 guy that everyone loved to have along with Curtis Granderson, and that's Corey Hart. He's doing something a little bit different this year. He had several years just, I guess you could say, in the wilderness, not really doing much of anything.
Yeah, we lost track of Corey Hart. Like you said, a former 2020 go-to fantasy player, and then the last 2 years or so, he dropped off the face of the planet. Look at him this year with all the power, all the home runs, all the RBIs. I think you got to look at him as somewhat of a sell-high guy, but he's already on pace for career year. You're getting what you can out of him, and I think you can either sell him and believe he's going to tail off, which I think he will, or continue to use him, and he'll be a decent power source. And I don't think you can go wrong either way, as strange as that sounds.
Remember, if you've had him up to this point, you don't have to give those stats back. They still belong to you.
Right, exactly. And, I had somebody on our blog ask us if they would trade David Ortiz and Corey Hart for Evan Longoria, and I don't know. I mean, it's a tough one either way. I could see it either way.
See, I mean, that one, I remember reading that one, and that's a very tough one because you know that, or at least have the feeling that Longoria is on his way up, even if he may not be this particular year, and it's kind of a year-to-year thing, whereas Ortiz and Hart for the past few years, they just have constantly been saying, like, no, they're on their way down, they're on their way down. But this year, they've been playing easily as well as Longoria has and probably been just as valuable.
Yeah, and you don't know, it's not guaranteed that they're going to tail off. You
Right.
can say that with Ortiz. He's still hitting in a hitter's ballpark. You can say that with Corey Hart. He's still hitting behind Ryan Braun and Prince Fielder. So you know he's going to get good pitches. It's just a matter of executing. And right now, Corey Hart is doing that.
Who's a hitter that has been particularly disappointing this year in your eyes?
Well, I reached up and got Pablo Sandoval in a couple drafts, and I am disappointed because I overlooked that, he's a free swinger. We all know that. The guy doesn't have a good plate discipline, and it's catching up with him this year in that lineup, in that ballpark. Again, those are two things we always have to look at. And I've been really disappointed with him to the point of I have him on the bench and don't play him every day in some of those head-to-head league situations.
Yeah, I mean, as a Giants fan, I have seen him play a lot, and I suspect, and I don't have the stats to back this up, but I suspect that his style of hitter would have high variance from year to year, where you get some sort of situation where one year he's going to hit 330 just as everything's falling in, because that's all he does is he makes tons of contact. But then other years he's going to be doing like he does this year, hitting, 275 now?
Right.
And not even cracking, has he even cracked double digits in home runs?
No, and the thing he does is the 1-for-4 night. I mean,
Yeah.
you get a lot of that in head-to-head. You get 1-for-4 with a double 1 RBI. Well, in a head-to-head league, that's not what you paid for, and that's not what you're paying him to do. You need him to hit, the 25 homers and hit in the 320 range, which he's not going to do this year. I don't think he will.
What about a pitcher who's been kind of disappointing this year?
Well, I think Wandy Rodriguez is an obvious answer. I know he got on track a little bit last night, and that's why I think he's an interesting buy low guy because of the high K rate, because he pitches well at home. But the fact that he pitches for an awful team, with that 5+ ERA and some of his starts when he blows up, and you just got to be careful with him. But that being said, if you want to spot start use him right now, I think it's not a bad idea.
Yeah, it's pretty sad because Wandy, at least in my little world, was one of those best kept secret type guys. Now, all my friends, the hardcore fantasy guys, knew about him, and then the other people who were treating the game more casually were just like, Wandy who? What are you talking about?
Well, and he's a guy, Brad Pinkerton and I talk every day about it. Brad still regrets passing on Ubaldo Jimenez and taking Wandy. He's that kind of guy, and they were going in that kind of round this year. And that just goes to show, last year Wandy was the lights-out guy, Ubaldo wasn't. This year, a totally different story, and that's where you have to be careful in the middle rounds.
Bill Bender, thanks for joining us on the Fantasy Source Fastball Podcast.
Oh, thanks for having me.